The race is on, and while the fight at the front grabs all the headlines, the midfield battle in F1 has been even more hard-fought than usual in 2025. So at the halfway point of the season, how does it really stack up? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to untangle the 6-team scrap are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. Unusual to have this little mini break, isn't it, before the doubleheader that leads into the proper August break?
Yeah, it's nice not to wait until August to have a little bit of a breather. And it comes at a nice time because, as you said in that intro, it is the halfway point, 12 rounds down, 12 rounds to go, whereas we tend to think of the summer break as sort of roughly around the halfway mark, and it tends to be where we take stock of battles like the midfield. But it's a good thing that we do this now because the midfield battle is so close that by the time we get to the August break, it might have changed completely, and we'll be doing a different podcast about how the midfield's looking.
We'll just keep repeating midfield podcasts endlessly. But Mark, it is a nice chance to take a little bit of stock of the performance patterns and that kind of thing, isn't it? Because when the races come so thick and fast, you do build that picture. But sometimes it's nice just to take a step back, connect everything together and just really delve into the detail of that scrap, particularly when it's the one that's from fifth place downwards.
Yeah, it's quite a closely packed little battle, and there are interesting patterns when you do stand back from it. And as it's changed, the pattern is changing. That's the probably the most interesting bit about it. But it's all still very open. It's an interesting little fight.
Absolutely. And that's why we're going to do this particular podcast. And we're going to work our way through each of the midfield teams. And we're going to do it not on championship position, but on our pace ranking. That's based on the fastest individual lap set by each team on every race weekend. And Scott, top of that metric is Williams, just. And that's matched by results. It's fifth in the Constructors' Championship with 59 points as well. But 51 of those points were scored in the first 7 events and just 8 in the last 5. So what's gone wrong?
Well, that's that could probably be a podcast entirely on its own with the various issues that have befallen Williams and both drivers, frankly, that have meant that, particularly in the last few races, they haven't maximised the opportunities and scored the points that they should have. It is worth pointing out that there has been a little bit of a performance drop-off. Not only was it the fastest car of the midfield teams on average over the first 6 races or so, it's now fallen to. It's still in the mix, but it's been third best over the last 6 races. If you take the super times, the fastest time of each team on any given weekend over the last 6, it's just behind Racing Bulls and actually Aston Martin over the last half a dozen events. But it's really close within that, whereas it had a tiny bit of margin. It was very consistent in the first 6 races. So there has been a little bit of a performance shift. It's come under more pressure. It's lost a little bit of margin that it had, but by having that kind of quality of car, and some weekends obviously stronger than others, there have still been opportunities to score more points than Williams has. What's undone it, beyond that slight loss of performance relative to its rivals, is a mix of poor reliability. Obviously, the engine issue that has afflicted Alex Albon and caused him to retire from 2 Grand Prix, Canada and Austria, has also been noticed on Carlos Sainz's car. It just hasn't become a terminal problem. They had some brake cooling issues for Sainz in Canada, which he was able to make the finish there. But Austria obviously didn't even make the start. The car caught fire in the pit lane after stopping on the grid. There's a little bit of weakness in execution. That's both in terms of how the team has nailed qualifying or its races, but also how its drivers have done. You know, Alex Albon made a mistake on the first lap of the Canadian Grand Prix, for example, fell behind Franco Colapinto, and then there was poor strategy from Williams thereafter. So he was long out of points contention even before his retirement. Carlos Sainz has underperformed a couple of times in qualifying, certainly. But then there's also just plain bad luck. Sainz was impeded by Isaac Hadjar terribly in Canada. Both cars managed to get front wing damage at the start in Spain very early in that race. And of course, I think the creme de la creme of nonsense incidents this year, Carlos Sainz innocently being wiped out of points contention at Silverstone while trying to overtake a Ferrari, and Charles Leclerc sliding into the front of his car as he did so because Leclerc lost control at Stowe very late. It was like 4 laps from the end, I think, at Silverstone or something like that. So yeah, sort of a quick fire run through. But you see why, when it comes to unpicking what's gone wrong for Williams, I think they've got various problems in various areas, and some of them aren't in the team's control.
It's a curious one, isn't it, Mark? Because you could argue that in terms of overall results, Williams perhaps slightly overachieved in the first part of the season, and now they've underachieved for reasons Scott's explained in the second part. So maybe they've results have kind of averaged out about where they should be, but the distribution hasn't been quite right, even though it is fair to say that other rivals are getting stronger at the same time. So it's also harder to get those results in recent months.
Yeah, I think there's something else going on there. I think the change in pace that Scott acknowledged, it came in quite a sudden step. So it is, as a percentage of their qualifying pace to pole position, we'll ignore Monaco because it's just a bit of an outlier. But up until Imola, when they were getting regular top 5 places in the race, their percentage to pole was 100.8, 100.7, 100.9, 100.7, 100.9, 100.8, 100.8, 100.4, 100.7 at Imola. So all quite consistent in the upper 100s. Spain onwards, it's 101.5, 101.4, 101.8, 101.0. So there's a step change. And what happened at Spain was the tech directives on the front wings. And I wonder if that is, I mean, correlation doesn't mean causation, as we often say, but it does look, it's such a big drop-off, and it's so sudden, and it's so consistent at the different tracks that it is quite striking. And you get the impression that they were quite comfortable in that, the sort of top of that midfield position, and they were well versed in how they were running their races from there, and it was all running nice and smoothly. And as they've sort of dropped into more of the, the closely contested part of the grid with more cars around them of their pace, I think it seems to have had a snowballing effect, a run-on effect on operations and reliability. The power unit issue is specifically not a Mercedes issue. It's some sort of Williams issue that affects the power unit. They're very tight-lipped about it. I would speculate something like intercooler or something like that, something that is a Williams part and not a Mercedes part. So there's all sorts of sort of the firefighting going on in various areas. So it's definitely been a half season of two halves, if you like, a season of two quarters.
The point that Mark makes about the front wing changes in Spain's very interesting. What's so difficult, and this is one of the reasons why we're kind of inspired to do this midfield only podcast, is trying to untangle so many different contrasting narratives and trajectories is really tricky, because that front wing change, the imposition of the new tests there to clamp down even more on flexible bodywork, came in the middle of various teams except Williams in the midfield bringing updates. Obviously, Aston Martin had a big one at Imola, which worked in quali, but they weren't that strong in the race there. But since then, Aston has been consistently very quick. We're going to get into that. Obviously, Sauber had an upgrade. Alpine had an upgrade. Haas even brought an upgrade at Silverstone last weekend. I'm blanking on what Racing Bulls have bought, but I seem to remember a couple of circuit-specific things within that run.
Yeah, so it's not been much for them in the past few races.
No, and I think it's therefore not a coincidence that as we're going to get onto, we've also seen them slip back a little bit with the Isaac Hadjar heroics have faded, even although Liam Lawson had a good one in Austria. But with Williams, we knew very early, they switched full focus, full active development to 2026 very early. So I think there are multiple kind of things coming together that mean it's lost its edge of pace. It's also had others catch up. There's other weaknesses that are being exposed now because of how hard it's either having to run or just the natural course of the season is uncovering certain limitations within the whole Williams system, not just in the car itself. So what I'm curious to see is what happens when an upgrade comes, which I think is coming before the summer break. It's basically the last, I think, 2025 upgrade for Williams, which has basically been in the works for a long time. And actually something Carlos Sainz said, I think it was either in Austria or Silverstone, it was during the last double header, was that while this isn't an upgrade that really takes into account their feedback from the first few races, it is something that has been planned for a while that should bring a lot of performance to the car. So it sounds to me like that's been in production for ages. If that's not like, and that might speak to the kind of manufacturing limitations that Williams has or what it's trying to manage, because the first few races were months ago now. So if this upgrade doesn't really take into account, the first 3 or 4 events of the season, that was signed off basically as part of the pre-season development program. It's just taken this long to get on the car.
Yeah, and it is interesting to pick up the Williams trajectory since Spain. They've been the 8th fastest car. I've got 4 race blocks for the average pace. We're slicing and dicing this lots of different ways, but it's an interesting way to look at it. But I guess the fact that Williams were very, very vocal about switching off the aero development, etc., means that there's not going to be vast amounts to come. But I still feel like if they can get on top of that vague cooling area problem they've got and just execute well, they've still got a car that can consistently be scoring decent points as well. So while they were kind of the leading midfielder early on, they're still kind of in that mix, I would say. Do you think that's what we should expect from them?
I would also just add within that in the first part of the season, so the first 6 races, yes, they had some really standout weekends where they were clearly best of the rest and, picking off a Ferrari in Miami and at Imola. But they also had races in the first 6 events where they weren't even best of the rest. They were slower than Racing Bulls one weekend, or Haas one weekend, or even Alpine in Bahrain. I think what was the real strength of Williams in the first 6 races or so was how consistent that car was. Like it was always like 5th or 6th best, and they were making the most of it. Certainly Alex Albon was making the most of it. And it just feels like everything across the board has just slipped over the last 6 races. And that's why you have such a you have a notable swing in performance terms, but a drastic swing in terms of points return.
Yeah, very much so. One other interesting way we've got to look at it is we've put together a kind of Class B championship, which is wiping out the top 4 teams and then reallocating results and points. So if you're the best non-top 4 team, you're the winner. So, for example, in Spain, Hulkenberg was P1 in that, and Albon's leading that by a hefty margin, 174 points to 137 of Hadjar, and Williams has a handy lead in the constructor standings, but it's been all over the map in terms of who's been winning them. So we'll kind of come back to that as the podcast progresses, because it's a useful little reference point to do. And I've also just noticed that my spreadsheet had some cell errors, so I'm just correcting the points to make sure we're right as we go on. But let's move on to Racing Bulls now, Mark. 6th fastest on average by a performance metric, actually very close to Williams on that average, but 7th in the standings on 37 points. What do you make of them so far?
Yeah, it's quite a nice car. It's a very drivable car. It's allowing Hadjar to really sort of extend himself in his rookie season, and he's impressed. I think the discrepancy between pace and results is largely down to the second car, so it's been quite unsettled. Of course, they started the year with Yuki Tsunoda and then swapped them around for Liam Lawson, and Lawson took a while to really get his eye back in with the team, and it just started to come good in Austria. He's looking quite handy in Silverstone as well. So it's taken that second car a while to really start, getting on the pace, and I think that's probably the main explanation for the slight discrepancy between its performance, the outright performance, and the Constructors' Championship. It's, as Scott said before, is particularly Aston, but also Sauber have improved of late. It's not been as regular a point scorer as in the first part of the season, but in terms of the car and the performance of the car, they hit the ground running really impressively, and they've sort of kept a good trajectory with, in terms of operations, but it's not just, it's just misfiring a little bit across the 2 cars.
They're an interesting case, Scott, because looking at Spain, where they had a front wing upgrade, Alan Permain, who's now the team principal, actually, he's been promoted to team principal since the most recent race. But he said that the front wing upgrade was kind of 80% because of the TD and 20% sort of general performance. So that's a great illustration of what you were talking about, where it'd be great if everybody just came with a stiffer version of their front wing, and then you've got a fair comparison. But there's performance in there as well. So that's an interesting point. But fast car. No car has been at the front of the midfield in qualifying more than Racing Bulls. 6 times they've had a Class B pole position, including the sprints as well. No one else has got more than 3, which is Williams. So it tells you that car's fast.
Yeah, it does. I do have a suspicion, though. I think that that car's peak might be lower than two or three other teams in the midfield, but not by much. And it's close enough that because the characteristics of that car invite the driver to get the most out of it, because it inspires confidence, it is usable. It feels like a car that the drivers can basically jump in and start throwing around quite a lot. I think it hits that peak more often than a lot of others do. Certainly has at certain times, which has allowed real confidence to shine through. And I think maybe a really good illustration of that is Hadjar's performance. Both cars really in Monaco, but Hadjar in particular, because Hadjar in Monaco hit the wall twice in practice, and one wall hit in practice in Monaco is enough to completely derail a driver's weekend if they lose confidence. But it didn't happen. He basically just got straight back in it, and that car's just nice and compliant when it's at its best. And we've seen that a few times. Look at how completely untroubled Lawson was when he found himself in a position to finish so strongly in Austria. And he basically drove around about 80% of the Grand Prix with Fernando Alonso sat in his DRS. Now, Fernando was very happy sitting in that slipstream and having the DRS and just getting towed along. But that's an ominous position for someone when someone like Lawson was really in need of a big result like that. But he felt very comfortable in the car. And you look at how bad he struggled in the first two races at Red Bull. It's the Racing Bulls that it's not just the right team for it. I think it's the right car to try and rebuild your confidence in. I feel like it's actually having just a slightly better version of a classic Red Bull 2 season. Like the one thing that's better certainly this year than last year is I don't feel like it's got lost this year in the way that it's perhaps been guilty of in the past. I believe it was one of the first teams last year to have to take an upgrade off the car when it was at the floor in Spain a year ago. That didn't quite work, and they were trying to unpick what had gone wrong. Don't feel like we've had those missteps this season. So overall, it's just being very tidy. It's kind of where you would expect it to be in the midfield, in that it has its moments as the best team. You don't really think it's going to finish fifth in the championship, but it's also looking at no risk like being the worst car at any point.
Yeah, very, very much so. And one thing that was interesting, Hadjar at Silverstone said others seem to kind of find more pace in qualifying. And I think that speaks to what we talked about a car that's quite easy to get to the limit of, but then it just kind of runs out of downforce, if you like. It's got its amount of downforce, and that hurts it, particularly in the fast corners, and you just can't go any quicker. So Hadjar didn't make Q3 at Silverstone, and he said, well, I just think that was what the car had. And so we see that quite a bit from them. But I suspect there'll be a handy team, because Lawson did have a bit of a wobbly time when he stepped back down. He was sort of had reasonable pace straight away, but things weren't coming together. And then, of course, he had that Austria weekend, which was really strong. So maybe he'll be a little bit more dependable in the next part of the season. Or obviously, Silverstone didn't go so well for him. But yeah, I kind of agree with you, Scott. What do you think, Mark? Racing Bulls feels like a bit of a midfielder of the midfield, doesn't it? And you like you say, you'd say it's not going to be last, and it's probably not going to be fifth come the end of the season.
Yeah, it's you know what you're going to get, and there's a lot of variance in the other teams according to track layouts and temperatures and everything, but that doesn't seem to affect the Racing Bulls' position in that little pack. It always seems to be at about the same place.
Is it the midfield team's midfield team? You know how some people like to, he's a racing driver's driver. He's someone that racing drivers really respect. That feels like what you're saying.
It's the team the other midfield team look upon with admiration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's like no, there's no, unless you're McLaren, there's no real ill feeling. Yeah. Exactly.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess the main thing with them is they've just got to avoid tripping themselves up on strategy, which, to be fair, they've been okay on recently. But it was China, wasn't it, where they were quick, but they just didn't recognise what everyone else did about the way the tyres were behaving, and ended up costing themselves quite badly. And that has been a thing that teams tended to do, but actually that's not happened too often this season, so I don't want to hold that against them.
They're improving, because there hasn't been a point where they've just completely unexpectedly put them out on a completely random set of tyres for what the session's about actually doing, which felt like... Yeah, that was very Toro Rosso, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were times when, for example, the medium would be the obvious starting tyre, and then you look and you'd see a Toro Rosso on a soft and a hard, and you think, well, neither of them are on the right tyre. I'm all for splitting, but come on. Anyway, but no, a good, sharp racing team. I think Laurent Mekies, who's now moved to Red Bull, has done a very, very good job there as well. So they're going to be there in the hunt in the second part of the year. Okay, Scott, let's move on to probably your favourite team now, Alpine. Say that with a due sense of dread. We've had some pretty choice words to say about them over the past few years, but seventh fastest on average, but last in the championship. So why is a car that genuinely looked like a threat to be midfield leader in testing been so disappointing? And how do you explain that disparity between pace and points?
Yeah, so I think there's two things we need to get into in Alpine. I think we need to get into team and car, but then I think we also probably should have a little bit of a conversation about the job that Pierre Gasly's doing, sort of not independently of that, but within that context. So should we go car first, Ed?
Well, unless you want to talk about the general nonsense, which is always good with Alpine, yeah, let's go car first. Let's keep it a bit more technical.
No, the nonsense goes hand in hand with a discussion about Alpine. So we'll focus on the car. So I think, first of all, we raise the caveat at testing every year that it's only at one circuit. But I think for once, this actually applied particularly strongly to one team. Because if you take the first sort of half dozen events of the season, the only race that looked anything like what Alpine was showing in preseason testing was when we went back to Bahrain for the race there, where Pierre Gasly was, and even Jack Doohan was a points threat at that race. Okay, it didn't come together, but it never looked like Alpine wouldn't score points basically in that Grand Prix. But that's a track of compromises sort of across the board. It's not like various other tracks we've gone to just seem to have individually brought out different weaknesses within the Alpine package. And I think if it was going to summarize the kind of trajectory of the season, I feel like they were one of the teams in the midfield hurt by the initial flexi-wing clampdown, which was on the rear wing, wasn't it? Introduced for the second round of the season in China. I think they might have been pushing that more than others, or as much as anyone else, because obviously they've got this established engine issue, which hurts them more in races than it does in qualifying, because that power unit doesn't harvest and then as a result deploy energy as effectively as other cars do. There's actually been a couple of suggestions this year, once or twice, where they've ended up having to recharge slightly in qualifying, let alone in the race. So a little bit of extra flex on the rear wing, I think, was their way of trying to help with that, a little bit more straight line speed during the races. I think once they lost that, there was a bit of vulnerability there, but there are also just inherent weaknesses within the package. So the engine is one of them, obviously, but I think that car is also slightly poor in terms of ride quality, which I think might be related to the fact that I think it's quite stiff. It's a, as I understand it, for example, Franco Colapinto, since he stepped in, has been surprised by just how stiff the Alpine is versus the Williams he drove last year, which was another tricky car to drive at times, but softer. You could feel where the limit was a little bit more. And all of that, I think, wraps up in as a car that in qualifying, I think you can get the best out of it, because you've got low fuel, you've got soft tyres, especially in someone like Gasly's hands. You've got a driver who can really wring its neck. Any kind of traits around the car where it moves around a bit more can kind of be hung on to over the course of the lap. Plus, I think there's at least a couple of occasions, Austria was certainly one of them, I think Silverstone as well, where because they know they've got that engine deficit, they run the car with a little bit less wing as well, which means that the car moves around a lot. I'm convinced that's one of the reasons why it was so bad on its tyres in Austria. I think it just basically didn't have enough downforce on the car and it was sliding way too much. But all of those things can be masked to a degree in qualifying. So that's why you see Gasly especially put in some of the results that it's had, and therefore you have that that overall lap time performance that we're talking about, why it's the seventh fastest car. But you can't hide all of that. You can't hide all of those different little bits of nastiness over the course of a Grand Prix. So more often than not, it slips back to where it should be in terms of the all-round nature of the car. And that's why I think, certainly up until Silverstone, I think Gasly's result there probably helped quite a bit. It seemed, in my opinion, to be the single biggest discrepancy between quali pace and race pace of any of the midfield teams.
Yeah, and Gasly was exceptional at Silverstone. You have to say, Mark, that Gasly is their kind of main weapon, isn't he? If you look at this Class B championship, he's up in fifth place in it. He's been the lead midfield driver once in a race in Bahrain, but he's had some other good results. He's twice qualified at the front of the midfield. And of course, the general nonsense with the second seat means that Doohan and Colapinto have not contributed a huge amount of points. Gasly scored 119 in our Class B reckoning. Colapinto and Doohan both have 21 points, which I'm not going to entirely blame on them, because chopping and changing and uncertainty hardly helps you get the best out of them. But it does show what a valuable asset Gasly is to that team, because it could be looking much worse. He's kind of on a smaller scale doing the Verstappen at Red Bull job for Alpine, isn't he?
Yeah, that's true, and you can see that the damage that not having a settled second car I don't know. I think with doing in the car in particular, there were real signs that the underlying pace was there. As there was a one occasion at least where he was generally faster than Gasly through the weekend, and something just went wrong in qualifying. So he was making, I feel, good progress, and I think we were about to see that translated, because you could see it was there. It was just a matter of putting the pieces together. And then you put Colapinto in, who's like totally alien to the car. He's come from a very different car, as Scott was saying, and it just, he's struggling. He's been struggling quite a lot. So there's that, as well as that's not the only nonsense going on there. Of course, there's upper management nonsense going on. I feel like, in factories where they health and safety and they have a workplace saying how many days since there's been an accident, I think they should have one on there saying how many days since there's been nonsense, and that would,
That'd be a very busy job, whoever's got to keep that updated. Although I think Scott would be quite enthusiastic about doing that. But that is part of it, isn't it? Because there's so much, it can't but undermine the team. Because even on the driver's side, there's the risk that Colapinto will get taken out before too long. And I think it was wrong to take Doohan out. And it's wrong once you put Colapinto in to then take him out, because we know he can deliver points in Formula One. And he's not had a great time, but you can't expect drivers to, in half a dozen race weekends, not these days, to get completely on top of the car, can you? Yeah, that seems to be what Flavio Briatore wants. And I know there's financial elements in it as well, but it's just no way to make sure you're getting the performance out of the car.
Yeah, I've got some sympathy for Colapinto. I think he's a better driver than he's been made to look in the situation he's in.
100%.
I think you have to say that there are too many mistakes that he shouldn't be making. I think that's fair. But there are also moments where he is starting to look like, okay, when it comes together, he can actually be quite close, or maybe even slightly faster than Gasly. That's why it was so frustrating when he slid off the road in the way that he did in qualifying at Silverstone, because he'd been faster than Gasly. He'd been dealing with the limitations of that car better through FP2, FP3, and even the first runs in Q1. But he's been he's on a hiding to nothing in the situation he's been put in the same way that Doohan was basically fatally undermined from the start. By putting Colapinto in and saying you need to be an upgrade on the driver that hasn't scored points, Briatore is basically, well, he's not just basically, like, I believe internally he has said, like, you need to score points. And so that creates an internal expectation and pressure within the team for Colapinto to deal with, which, there's always pressure in Formula One. So maybe there's limited sympathy for it, but it's for Doohan and Colapinto have been given two of the rawest deals of drivers in the last few years that I can remember. And you take Liam Lawson, and he got 2 races at Red Bull. At least he stayed in F1. He stayed in the race seat when they dropped him, whereas Doohan's been completely screwed over by the situation he's in. So I've got a lot of sympathy there, but that's also one of the reasons why I've been so impressed by what Gasly's been doing, because he's just basically got his head down. He's had 1 or 2 Gasly weekends where he's either a bit anonymous or he gets a bit too sort of caught up in his own head during a race and spirals. Austria, that was a terrible one from a car point of view, but I don't think Gasly handled that as great as he could. But he bounced back superbly at Silverstone, both in terms of his performance on track, but the way he was working off it, the way that he worked with the team to try and unpick all of the problems that he found on Friday. As I understand it, they were changing all sorts of things on the car over the course of the weekend. So I think while Alpine's the great underachiever in the midfield this season, I actually think Gasly's the big overachiever. I think he's doing an astonishing job. And you mentioned the points discrepancy from a Class B perspective and that fictional championship. Alpine, the only 2 drivers that haven't scored a point in the real world championship this year are Doohan and Colapinto. And Gasly, it's off the top of my head, but I believe Gasly is ahead of a Williams driver, an Aston Martin driver, Haas driver. He's basically ahead of a driver from, I think, every team in the midfield, and Alpine's behind a lot of them. And I don't think there's a better way of summarising how good a job Gasly's doing than that.
Yeah, very much so. He's saving them from greater nonsense and embarrassment, you'd have to say. But yeah, it's looking like a pretty tough car, and it's going to depend on him doing Silverstone type jobs on the weekends when the car's going to be good, because so many times he's been qualifying well, and then you go backwards because of that race pace limitation. Anyway, let's move on to Aston Martin now, Mark. 8th fastest on average performance and on points, but level with Racing Bulls in that regard. But there has been tangible improvement, hasn't there? Is it enough?
It's going in the right direction at last, and that was the concern, that they did seem to be lost last year, and every change they made seemed to make the car worse. And you did wonder about if they understood what was going on. And so there's been a little bit of a reshuffle and a bit of a tidy up of the car, which came at Imola, which was quite a significant test of the new structure that had been put in place and the validation of the update in the new tunnel. So initially, at Imola, it didn't really wasn't such a clear indication if it was working, but they've stuck with it, and since then it's got progressively better and progressively faster, and it's now showing signs of actually pulling itself away from this midfield battle in terms of pace, and sort of hanging on to the back of the next group. But there's still progress. There's still more to come, I think. But it's looking good. It's the first time. Well, how many races we've Imola? There's 5, 6.
It's 6. I think it's the halfway point. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that 6 race period, it does look like a team on the up at last, because it's been under delivering for quite some time. So yeah, quite promising there, I would say.
I've got it as from Imola inclusive onwards is 6 and 6 for the first half of the season, and I've got it as the fastest midfield team in that sort of in Q2 basically of 2025. Not by much, but the fastest midfield team on average since that upgrade came in, which is obviously a good indicator. But obviously the question you asked Mark was, is this enough? But Mark, how would you answer that question if you were Lawrence Stroll?
Oh, I think Lawrence will be impatient, and he probably won't think it's enough. But I think he will have learned by now that things don't happen as quickly as he would like them to. There's been many examples of that, and it's it's down Andy Cowell and Adrian Newey and people like that, people who he's placed his trust in, that to explain to him, the whys and wherefores. No, I'm sure he gets it, but it still won't make him any less impatient, I'm sure. Which is fair enough. That you need that push and that drive, as long as it doesn't stray over into interfering with the people who are actually doing it. And there's no sign that it is.
Yeah, he's not just giving them his trust; he's given them basically an open checkbook, hasn't he? He's spared no expense in turning that around. And I think, in all seriousness, there will be a sense of relief, but also, pride to a degree that it is starting to come together, or looking like it is starting to come together. And the way that Aston Martin are, that they're obviously very, very keen to play down the impact that or attention that Newey's having on 2025, and it's all about 2026. But they have admitted to these lunchtime conversations, and depending on who you talk to, there's different degrees of influence that Newey's had on what has been already improved on the 2025 car and the areas to look in. And one thing we've always said about Aston in the past is, narrative counts for a lot in Formula One. Momentum and trajectory counts for a lot. And you remember 2023, when obviously they had that mega start to the season. By the end of the year, they obviously got overhauled by McLaren and fell behind McLaren in the championship. And I remember at the time, a couple of people at the team insisting that you couldn't look at it like that. You had to look at it as the season overall, and it's still been a very good season overall. But I didn't buy that at all, because it was on the wrong trajectory. If you start the season doing one thing and end the season doing the complete opposite, that's a bad thing, regardless of whether the end result is good compared to the season before. What's really encouraging at the moment for Aston Martin is it's going in the other direction. I would say for the first time convincingly since the first year of this rule set, they made good progress over the back half of 2022, but then they stagnated. What's quite good at the moment is I would say it's the first time in 2.5 years they've actually brought stuff to the car that's worked properly. in terms of actually actively making the car quite considerably better. There are clearly still limitations, and it's certainly Fernando Alonso who's getting more out of it than Lance Stroll, who doesn't seem quite as happy in the car since they've made certain changes. But it's a team that's unmistakably going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd actually say it's a really, really encouraging trajectory for Aston Martin, because I've talked about this before. What was most important was less the overall performance, but to see that they can put bits on the car that work. You can see hints of the Newey effect in there as well, just in terms of how they're developing the kind of numbers they're looking for, how they're crunching all their aero numbers to make decisions, etc. So I actually think that's really, really positive for Aston Martin, and we're regularly seeing Alonso sticking it in Q3 and having some decent races. So I'm prepared to be very, very upbeat about them. And if they can continue that trend that you've talked about, Scott, with them being basically the quickest midfield team, I've also got the 4 race averages in the last 4 races. They're fifth best in that could be very, very positive. Although it will show up the Stroll disadvantage. You won't dwell on too much because people kind of know where we are on that. But you've got Stroll on 79 points and Alonso on 119 in our Class B championship, and there is that is distorted a little bit by Alonso having a few more retirements. And Alonso's made a few mistakes as well. Actually, he's not been completely perfect, but he has been very good. But interested to see how Aston fare as the season progresses and whether they can bang another upgrade on that car and maybe even leave the midfield a little bit behind them. Right, let's move on to the penultimate team now, Scott, ranked by our optimum performance. 9th on average pace, surprisingly so probably, and also 9th on points with only 29. Both of those figures I feel should be more impressive given how good that car is, really, shouldn't they?
I'm not so sure. I think that car can be very good, but I feel like that's very Haas. Like it's never been the most consistent performer in the midfield, but it's had some weekends that make you just go, where's that come from? Last year was obviously a very, very strong year. This year, I think there have been some weekends that were like, you go back to Australia and you wouldn't be saying, if we'd go back to Australia and said that 12 races in, Haas won't be last in the championship, Komatsu and his team would have absolutely bitten our hands off for that. But they recovered from that really well. And that car, when it works well, I think is very competitive in the midfield. I think they did go through a period where they were kind of treading water a little bit. They hadn't had updates, and actually the new parts that they had at Silverstone last weekend were actually what you might term the sort of first normal upgrade that they've had this year, because the other upgrades before that were related to obviously front wing and technical directive change in Spain, but also the floor changes that they brought initially in Japan, and then I think they had another one after that. That was mostly about correcting the issues that they discovered in Melbourne. The Silverstone upgrade was what I think, I can't remember if it was, it must have been Komatsu. Rather, we spoke to Andrea Desordo, the technical director in Austria, but I think it was Komatsu who said it's basically their first just pure performance upgrade of the season. They've waited until basically round 12 to introduce that. So I think they actually did quite a good job, showed how solid the baseline of the car was, that they were still hanging in there, scoring the odd point. Esteban Ocon, who has had a few anonymous weekends and weekends where he's been pummeled by Ollie Behrman for pace, has also had a few just like peak Esteban Ocon weekends where he's either absolutely nailed it and got a result way better than you think Haas should get, or he's just done one of those races like he did in Austria, where he just quietly gets on with a really, really strong strategic execution and steals a point. So I think that's helped. But I think there's also been a couple of big missed opportunities. Ollie Behrman's one at Silverstone was the big one. A bit of recency bias potentially in terms of how we judge the quality of Haas's car. But that upgrade that they brought at Silverstone really worked. And in Behrman's hands, the car looked like nailed on Q3 on Saturday and was, but he got a stupid grid penalty for that crash in the pit lane. And then they had an absolute disaster of a race, like the wrong strategic calls. The drivers managed to drive into each other. It was an absolute nightmare. So I think it's been a pretty Hassy season, to be honest. But the underlying thing that will encourage them is that the car is quick.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think there's one of the reasons I feel, Mark, they should have had a few more points is Behrman has often been the quicker driver, but has found lots of ways to not get the results maybe he should do, as well as having a few 11th place near misses as well. And obviously Ocon has had some great weekends and a few up and down. I find it really hard to say what to make of Haas, because Scott made a good point. I was really impressed with that upgrade they brought to Japan, because they didn't have time to put it in the wind tunnel. It was basically a best guess. We think these are the problems we had. They put it on the car and it worked. And then the proper version was in that same direction. So that does speak well of a team that's got real understanding of what its car's doing, which is always kind of number one on your objective list, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make. Their understanding is quite good. Their development facilities are still limited by the structure and the size of the team. And I think if you could combine Behrman's raw pace with the sort of professional execution of Ocon, and you could have two of those, I think they would be right up there in this little midfield battle, probably just within sniffing distance of Williams, probably. But they have what they have, and for historical reasons. But I think the potential is shown. It the potential of the car we can see is pretty good. I just worry a little bit about the reset of the new regulations and whether that might leave Haas a little bit gasping again. But certainly through this regulation set, I think it's been quite impressive how they've delivered a car with real underlying performance.
Interestingly, they're actually doing quite well in our little Class B championship. Haas is actually third in that, not so far off Racing Bulls, and that probably reflects the fact they've had obviously more in that kind of 11th, 12th, 13th, unrewarded in the real points table, but rewarded in this world. So perhaps if you look at those points, that speaks a little bit better of Haas's execution as well. But yeah, there's still definitely been too much left on the table there. Should we move on to Sauber now, Mark? They've been the surprise package, haven't they? Resoundingly pilloried by us, me in particular, after pre-season testing, and actually justifiably so, because the car looked pretty terrible. But although it's on average the slowest car, they're up to 6th in the championship, 35 points in the past 4 events, that podium in Spain for Nico Hülkenberg. There is genuine momentum there in that team, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think it was probably made look worse than the situation really was by how bad the car was initially. And that was a reflection of it was just a very, very basic car with no... All the other teams had race one developments ready to go on the car, and they didn't. They were behind just because they're a little team, and the production takes a long time, and all those usual reasons. But they knew what they had coming, and they didn't give the impression that they were panicking. They gave the sort of quiet, everything's sort of under control, and you were looking at it and thinking, really, I mean, you're solid last year. The car's trailing at the back, but all of a sudden, when those parts, and they've probably put more new parts on than any team, I would say. And the impressive thing is they seem to work. Each time they put a small upgrade on it, it seems to make the car better. And yeah, obviously we've got the headline of Nico Hülkenberg's podium at Silverstone, but that was a very particular set of circumstances. But even so, even without that, they've been banging in the points on very, very regular levels since these upgrades have come good. So it's still perfectly feasible to see a Sauber go out and Hulk was out in Q1 at Silverstone, wasn't he? But it's also perfectly feasible to see one sort of nibbling at the edges of Q3. So, I think this is very promising. They're showing all the signs of becoming at last an efficient little race team. Just at the point they're about to become enormously bigger under Audi. So again, I have slight concerns about their prospects for next year, but. Just for this year, I think they can be very happy with their progress.
What I think is very important to be aware of with what Sauber's doing at the moment, when you look at the results that they're getting, there's obviously, everybody's aware that there's a degree of overachievement in what they've done. Not just obviously the Hülkenberg podium at Silverstone, but just the sheer number of points in those runs, because obviously they have very opportunistic in Spain as well, where Hülkenberg was 5th. And the stat that everybody's kind of getting very excited by around the Silverstone weekend was that they've outscored Red Bull in the last few races. So I know that there is already an understanding that there's overachievement, but I think people are perhaps missing just how much they're overachieving by, because they're still they're still quite unimpressive on actual outright performance. And you might think, okay, well, that's a legacy of the first part of the season, but it's actually not. I don't know how you guys rank it. And Ed, I know you've got your various splits, but I have Sauber actually tracking further off the overall pace in the second quarter of the season so far than in the first quarter. So there's a and they'll be delighted by this irony, but there's a beautiful irony in the fact that their massive upswing in terms of results have come when actually, like in raw terms, the cars got slower. But it's about that relative performance versus the other midfielders and the individual peaks within those weekends, because the car wasn't at its absolute best in Austria and Silverstone, for example, not as impressive over one lap as we've seen it in other places. Obviously, Bortoleto was into Q3 in Austria, but it looked a harder slog those 2 weekends for Hulkenberg in particular, but they've banked mad points in those 2 races. So it's just interesting how F1 works like that. You can be so strong and so theoretically deserving of a good result for so long and not get it. And then depending on how certain circumstances go and how good a job you do, even if you don't have the fastest car, suddenly you can get a massive reward seemingly out of nowhere.
Operationally, they've become better through the season, and Jonathan Wheatley joining is being given a lot of credit for that. So you probably justifiably, and so I think that is part of the team has become a tighter, operationally better unit as the season has gone on.
Yeah, and last year there were big operational problems. I think lots and lots of little mistakes here and there. And I'm not specifically talking about that early pit stop problem, because that was actually not a design problem, but it's a metallurgy problem, if you like, in terms of when the temperature got up. That wasn't operator failure. That was just down to the chemistry of the metals involved and the temperature. But just, even when the car had its moments, they tended to find ways not to optimise the result. But that's not happening so much this year. And I think Mattia Binotto's played a part in that as well. Obviously, sort of the next step above Jonathan Wheatley and looking at the bigger picture. But that's really encouraging. And that's what Sauber needs to do to actually look like a credible racing team. And it has now. And that's encouraging for the Audi era, because we were a little bit worried they were just sleepwalking into that Audi era and just thinking that you flick a switch, change the signs, and then suddenly everything's different. But this is good, and you're right, they're not going to sustain that performance. It's still a car you'd probably say most likely they're going to qualify top of Q2. That's kind of where they are. And early in the season, they were kind of, if you do a good job, they were bottom of Q2, top of Q1. So that probably reflects the improvement. But looking at my 4 race blocks, they're basically exactly the same deficit to the front in each of the four race blocks through the season. So it's an interesting development for them. And I think, kind of as a conclusion, it's interesting. We've used this sort of Class B championship framework. It's interesting to imagine sort of what the narrative would be if this was the battle at the front and those top 4 teams weren't there. It would be, at the moment, one of Alex Albon's got a big lead, 174 points to Hadjar's 137. But, can he hold on? That, I think, would be what the narrative is, isn't it? And then we'd probably be saying, well, will there actually be a consistent challenger, or will it ebb and flow? How would you spin that narrative, Scott? I
would look at it more that the bigger threat comes from further back. In that Hadjar's done an excellent job to be up there and be in the position that he's in, but that's not the immediate threat to Albon and Williams. I'd be looking at Alonso in the Aston Martin really as the main worry there, because I think that one of the things that fascinates me about the midfield fight this year, and I've spoken to a couple of the team bosses around this, and I think there is sort of broad agreement in this theory. I think this is the closest midfield we've ever had, and I say that in that knowing full well that every year we seem to have a conversation about how close the midfield is. But there's usually 1 or 2 teams breaking away at the front and 1 team left behind at the back, a crisis team. Well, the crisis team just finished 6th at Silverstone last weekend and has the 7th fastest car. So that shows you how competitive it is. And the team that was running away at the front of the midfield has been caught and is less than 20 points clear now. The 2 teams that started the year looking like no hopers for points in terms of pure performance terms, Sauber and Aston Martin, well, one of them has just scored a podium and the other one's now the fastest car in the midfield. It's amazing, this fight. Like, if we had this at the front, we would be losing our minds over it. And I actually think it's so close that a single upgrade will be the difference between a team finishing 5th and 6th in the championship or 9th and 10th in the championship. There's basically 0.2 of a second. If you can find a tenth or two between now and the end of the season, or ideally now in the next few races, and then maintain that for the rest of the year, that could be worth tens of millions in the championship by the end of it. It's such a fascinating contest, and it's close enough that I do wonder if one or two teams that aren't absolutely fully committed to 2026 and definitely happy with sacrificing this year, I can see one or two teams getting tempted into, getting suckered into just rolling on the 25 development just that little bit longer, because there's a big prize up for grabs if you do get something right in the second half of this year.
And it's a very stark question, that one, isn't it, Mark, whether you go for that, because with the ATR, the aerodynamic testing regulations and the limitations on wind tunnel time and CFD items, if you're putting a little bit more back onto 25 development, you're taking it away from 26. And you might be giving away a tenth of improvement on the 26 car for 200ths of improvement on this year's car. But then you're saying, well, what's worth what? The extra money involved, etc. So it's really interesting. We know where Williams are because they're pretty much all in on 26 from fairly early on. So we will. I imagine we'll see little bits and pieces because you can do upgrades without doing vast amounts of wind tunnel testing. But it's just going to be little tidying up bits. But all the other teams are in a slightly different position, and they will have been recently trying to work this out, won't they? But there's also teams who have things they need to prove, like Williams will need to continue to invest effort in trying to troubleshoot this cooling problem, because you want to know why it's there. It's all this thing, even though it's new cars last year, your understanding is there. So who do you feel might be the one that would be tempted, Mark, of the teams to throw a few more % of their resources at this year for the rest of the year?
I think probably if I was Alpine, I would be looking at trying to get to the bottom of this is inconsistency. I think I'd be not worrying too much about how much wind tunnel time we are robbing ourselves of or not robbing ourselves of. I think I would be looking at really uncovering why we're not regularly accessing our potential. Probably Alpine, but I think in terms of the remainder of the season, it's got all the ingredients for within this little 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 teams. The 16 group, it's got all the ingredients for Alonso to be going on the rampage and just he could conceivably win them all within this group. So I think that's how it would. That must be the worry of the others, and even though they would be robbing themselves of quite a lot of wind tunnel time by heading that group in the Constructors' Championship for 26, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in how much improvement you're going to make under a new set of regulations like that. I don't think you can think like that. You just have to maximize, go on full attack, and I think I don't think they need to be thinking about improving the car any further, other than better understanding it. I don't think they need to be thinking about putting any wind tunnel time on that car. I think it's shown itself to be intrinsically fast enough now that they can just crack on with it and see what they can get out of this season, which started so unpromisingly. And then you've just got a nice launch pad into the new Edd Straw era.
I was just going to say I actually think we might see one more upgrade from Aston Martin in the second half of the year, after the summer break. They've got something coming still already, that's been confirmed, but I think they might be tempted to do one more, because Andy Cowell said he's not ruled out putting the 25 model back in the wind tunnel. And I wonder if part of that, because you've been mentioning the ATR and the restrictions, I wonder if part of that's motivated by the fact that obviously the allocations for the second half of this year are set, and Aston's one of the big winners from it, because they were 5th last year, but they were 8th at the point where the reset was done this time around. So they've actually got more wind tunnel time and CFD allowance than a lot of those immediate rivals. I think they might get tempted into just borrowing a tiny bit of that just to get the result over the line in 2025, knowing that a lot of that, the steepest part of the development trajectory on the 26 car will be in the second half of this year, and maybe then bank on the fact that because Nui's the one that's doing it and leading it all, you can't put an ATR limit on the wind tunnel that runs in his head. So they'll be able to then capitalize on that in the first part of next year. I can just see it going that way. I can see a little bit of pressure from Lawrence Stroll just to really maximize the end result in 25. You see the momentum that Alonso has, blah blah blah, the temptation to just keep delivering on this upgrade potential that they've seen. I don't think they're going to throw away 2026 in pursuit of it or anything like that. I'm not suggesting that there's not good leadership or strategic planning there, but given Cowell has openly said he has not ruled out putting that car back in the tunnel briefly to validate something, it just wouldn't surprise me to see something small come on the car after the summer break.
So it looks like we're setting up the Class B Championship battle to be Albon, who's on 174 points, versus Alonso, who's down in 6th, 55 points behind. So that has a little hint of last year's scenario, doesn't it, with Verstappen well ahead and Norris trying to catch up but not doing so, but perhaps the greater chance of Alonso doing it. So
Alonso gets the chance to experience what 2012 was like from the other perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure he'll be delighted if he gets to the end of the year and we tell him he's won Class B. That's just the kind of thing he'll be thrilled by. So it's I think that's the great thing. It's well worth keeping an eye on that battle and just seeing who's at the front of it, because basically every team has had at least one win in this Class B fight this year. Every team apart from Sauber has had at least one pole. So it's all over the map, and it's a really interesting storyline. So it's been great to be able to delve into that. So thanks very much, Scott and Mark, for your insight. We've got a little bit of time to go before F1 gets going again at Spa, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.